Welcome to Complicating the Narrative. I'm your host, Salma Abdallah. This month, on the Purple Public Health Project, we're taking up the question of disagreement and how we can disagree in a productive manner. However, it's one thing to call for productive disagreement in the abstract, and it's another to build a space where it happens, and to keep that space civil when the people in it do not trust each other. Brinda Adhikari is an award-winning journalist, producer, and showrunner with 25 years in the media. Most recently, she was the executive producer and showrunner of The Problem with Jon Stewart. Today, she co-hosts Why Should I Trust You?, a podcast that brings public health experts, physicians, and people deeply skeptical of both into the same conversation. We get into the craft of setting up a hard conversation, why she measures success by connection rather than persuasion, where these exchanges sometimes break down, and what public health might borrow from how she works. Brinda, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much. It's wonderful to be here.
I was just telling you, it's odd after listening to it and watching so many of your episodes to actually have a conversation right now. It's great. I'm getting used to whether you're going to give me feedback or talk back to me, or am I just going to keep pushing the next button to hear your next video. But I'm really excited about talking to you today. And I want to start by just maybe telling the audience who might not know, some of our audience might not know about Why Should I Trust You? And if they don't, they should really listen to it, because I think it's central to a lot of the conversations we're having in the Purple Public Health conversation. So why did you start Why Should I Trust You? Who are you? And why did you think it was an important conversation to have?
So I'm a journalist. I've been in media for almost 25 years. And my co-host, Tom Johnson, is also, he's an incredible journalist. And he's also been in media for a really long time. And together with Maggie Bartlett from Johns Hopkins and Dr. Mark Abdulmalik, we decided that we wanted to create the show at a time when there's increasing mistrust of institutions, of expertise. And particularly, we were observing it in the space of public health, science, mainstream medicine. And because we come from mainstream media and we're very used to, people not trusting us, we wanted to start the show. And what we wanted to do was create a platform that actually invited conversations with the people who mistrust the systems. Instead of just talking about the mistrust as an academic subject, we wanted to actually invite conversations with people to understand how they got to a place where the systems don't work for them, where they're not trusting them, where maybe the systems aren't influencing them the same way. I want to be careful to not assume it's all about trust. It's also about influence here. And so we decided that that's kind of how we wanted to approach it.
So before we start talking about the podcast itself, did you find it hard to work with people who are, you're journalists, but also academics/physicians? So how did you work, the four of you together, to make sure that you have, at least if not a common understanding what needs to be done, but also how do you deal with your internal disagreements of what needs to be covered versus not?
We really like each other as a group, which really helps. Yeah. Tom and I have known each other for decades. Mark and I have known each other for decades. And even though Maggie, we've just recently met, she's so great. And she brings such a humble sense of curiosity to this process. And I think it really helps that so many of us know each other because we have a shorthand with each other. We really don't actually spar that much, the four of us. I think we're really on the same page about why we're doing what we're doing. We may occasionally have debates about which topics to cover, but the truth is, we really believe in our mission. And if occasionally we have disputes about how we arrive at something, those are quickly resolved because we really value what it is we're trying to achieve. So if anything, I welcome us to disagree even more sometimes with each other. But no, it's mostly that we really believe in what we're doing. And I think our different disciplines, we have a physician, an academic, two journalists. Mark's a journalist too, but he's also a physician. I think it actually just adds to the kind of the multi-sectoral view of how we approach problems. In fact, I think that's probably a positive more than a negative.
So then when you're starting a conversation with people who disagree, and I think I've seen some of the episodes, you have people who are part of the MAHA movement, but you also have people who work within public health. I think you had Caitlin, I think.
Caitlin Jetelina, yep.
Yeah, Caitlin Jetelina, sorry. And I met her before. She's amazing. And I think she's one of the few people who actually managed to bridge that conversation between academia, but also people who are not necessarily think that public health or even the medical establishment is giving them good information. But even her, I've listened to some of the episodes, and sometimes it's hard to have a conversation with someone who just doesn't agree with anything that you're presenting. So before you start those conversations, can you walk us through How do you make sure that it's generative, at least as much as you can? Do you sit with people beforehand, discuss the points of disagreements, or do you just start the conversation and hope or open up the conversation in a way that brings trust and make people feel like they can share whatever they're thinking without being judged?
Yeah. So one thing is we set the bar pretty low in terms of what
Okay.
success is. Generative to me is not necessarily that we come away with it with solutions or we come away with it having solved some big problem. But it's more, how did we occupy the space together? Have we ever occupied spaces like this together? And would we ever want to do it again? Like, that's sort of success to me. There are some conversations where we achieve that, other conversations where maybe they're a little bit more difficult and certain people maybe don't want to talk to each other again. But mostly, I think, in the beginning, what we do is we just try to achieve a baseline of a rapport. It's really important to have a rapport in these conversations. I find sometimes, when you watch cable news conversations or debates, on like CNN or Piers Morgan or whatever, or those Jubilee style conversations where people are going at it, there's something about it just to me that seems kind of a false condition that we set. That's not actually how people meet. When you meet somebody, you introduce yourself, you ask where you're from, you maybe chat for a little bit about like what you do, do you have kids, those kinds of things. But instead, we have these situations and more media platforms where it's just you immediately get into the disagreement. And when you do that, all that does is it sort of like primes you for conflict, right? And so what we try to do on our show is we try to create conditions that are not primed for conflict, but are primed for some sort of a rapport and some sort of a sense of, oh, okay, so we align a little bit on some of our values, Yeah. And then once you do that, it actually makes the difficult topics, you're trusting a little bit that the person there isn't there to just like slam you, but they're there because they're actually trying to work through friction to see like either where you may have things in common or to really understand where you're coming from when they disagree.
Do you ever start a conversation thinking someone here is going to persuade the other? Or is the point there someone is going to present enough facts or enough arguments that the other side is going to be persuaded, including you? Or is it usually, it would be helpful even if the two sides just have a conversation, just present their points of views, and that is just a good place to end?
Persuasion is something that's so, I think, difficult and almost, I would say, and this is a tough word, but sometimes arrogant to assume that you can do. There's data out there from behavioral scientists who suggest that persuasion through facts rarely happens. Most persuasion and change in behavior happens because somebody you know and love and trust tells you something they're doing and that'll persuade you. But to expect somebody who's a total stranger to persuade you through one conversation, I mean, I think anybody who thinks that happens is probably in for disappointment. And I think maybe we assumed people were persuaded by things because we saw that they complied with things. But I think compliance and being persuaded are actually two different things. We frequently meet people, for instance, who vaccinate their kids, but are increasingly getting or growing mistrustful of vaccines. And so if there were a COVID-like situation, God forbid, but I'm sure it's going to happen in the future, it's unclear how they would respond. They may have given their kids, they may have had their kids vaccinated when they were babies, but moving forward, if something like that were to happen, I don't know how they would respond. So I would say, going back to your original premise about, is it persuasion or is it just enough to have the conversation? I'd say for me, the mark is connection. Is there some sort of a connection made here, some sort of a discovery made, that a learning, that when you hear someone say something about an experience they had at a doctor's office that led them down a particular track, or a doctor who talks about their experience treating somebody in a COVID ward, does that lead to some sort of an aha moment in maybe somebody who's more skeptical of systems? And I think we don't have enough moments where we learn from each other through disagreement. I consider myself, I wish people could like download my mind in terms of the things I learn based on conversations I have, because it's so rewarding. You learn so much when you figure out why someone mistrusts something instead of immediately going to that place of like, how can I get you to change your mind, right? First have to sort of sit with the understanding of like how someone got here. I think it's actually more of the scientific process. You have to be in that observation mode for a little bit before you can kind of create the experiment or whatever. I hate to even use the word experiment because that's not what we're doing here, but I just mean in terms of like a one-to-one of process.
Yeah. I think the most humbling person for me is my mother, because a lot of the time, so she's like a Sudanese lady who's well educated in Sudan, but at the same time, she didn't have the greatest experiences with the medical system. And a lot of the times I honestly feel bad. I get her to do things by just saying, just trust me. Because just now, everything she gets from her doctor, she doesn't believe. But the benefit I have is that I'm her daughter, and she thinks if I tell her just trust me, more likely than not, that is something she should do. But left to her own devices, she wouldn't. And then more recently, she named ChatGPT. She thinks that's the best doctor she had. And I asked her why. And she's like, of course, he's a he. She gave ChatGPT a gender. And then she said, well, he's actually very kind, very patient with me, which was very interesting because when she had her issues with the medical system in Sudan, I wasn't in Sudan. I was here. So I wasn't part of her experiences, but it was the main issue. Apparently, was just the lack of patience. She's well educated. She wanted to ask a lot of questions, and the doctors were just unwilling to answer her questions. And because of that, and then she has side effects and she wonders what's happening, no one explaining. And ChatGPT is just willing. She said, like, I can ask so many questions and he will just keep giving me back answers. And that's fascinating to me because I've never even thought before to ask her, like, why do you have issues with the system? I revert to, please trust me. And I'm wondering right now, like, how long will it take for her to say, oh, I don't even trust you because you guys just keep telling me, just trust me, which is just I'm using my connection with her. But it is deeply humbling to just listen to my mother talk about the healthcare system and what she's going through. Yeah.
Absolutely. I mean, I think the way that we interact with the people in our lives, that really is ultimately what we're getting at here, right?
Yeah.
That who are the trusted messengers in our lives? Who do we go to when we're confused? And, it used to be when the information ecosystem was much simpler, that there were just a few places we would go to. And the truth is, I think we as a society may have had a bit of a different relationship with expertise, kind of pre-internet, pre-social media.
Yeah.
And now it's almost like instead of viewing it as the enemy, how do we work with it and kind of accept the conditions of a society that increasingly is getting information from many different sources and actually trust their peers? The Edelman Trust Report says that a lot of people, particularly young people, trust their peers as much, if not more, than doctors. And so in a way, it's, I think, realizing that scientists and doctors and institutional people have an opportunity to try to be influential and try to make a difference in places beyond their institutions, that they have value in spaces beyond their institutions. And how do we unlock that? And maybe that they aren't the right messengers sometimes.
Yeah.
That maybe the fact is, in fact, they have to sort of share the work and gift the work to somebody else who is a more trusted messenger. And how do we identify trusted messengers? That could be a great priority,
Yeah. And I think that's, at least for me, the benefit of listening to your podcast is helping us, hopefully public health professionals, but also physicians, recognize that listening to the stories of how people don't trust us brings us back from throughout medical school. Every doctor who listens to this will know we're always told we're the ultimate authority and people just do the things we tell them. And maybe listening to some of the podcasts like the ones you have would make us realize, A, we live in a world where information is way more democratized. And we should just be more okay with that. But also, as you said, likely sometimes we're not the best messenger for something. I'm always fascinated by how it seems like the most opposition I'm getting for ChatGPT or AI in general, I'm not saying ChatGPT is the best thing ever or AI. It seems like it's physicians. Other people seem to value, I get more information now, of more control of what is happening to me, even though I think the public should worry more about, are you getting the most accurate information when you're using this? But they feel they have more information than the doctor is giving them. And I'm always fascinated by, it seems like at least my friends, my colleagues who are practicing medicine are the ones who are at most resistance to, for some good reasons sometimes, but I think some of it is also we feel like some of our authority is being taken away from us, and we don't like that.
Absolutely. I mean, look, as a journalist, we've been seeing this for decades. Everybody thinks they're a journalist, right? I mean, even the concept of being a journalist has become so devalued to the point where you're seeing massive layoffs, you're seeing, consolidation of companies, people who are citizen journalists. I mean, we've been through this for years, and I can imagine as a doctor, it must be crazy. And look, a doctor, the stakes are so high with doctors. You're in the business of saving lives. And it's got to be really crazy when you have a patient come in and try to kind of explain to you what their, chatbots have told them what the problem is. And if it doesn't align with there was a study done by, I think, the Cambridge University folks who said that, there's evidence to suggest people want to see doctors who are aligned with them politically and
Yeah.
don't want to see doctors who aren't aligned with them politically. So these are really challenging times. And I think part of it is realizing that we are not in zero-sum moments anymore. It's not
Yeah.
either trust the doctor or trust AI. You sort of have to live in both and.
Yeah.
And figure out a way that your identity and your expertise is living alongside of a whole other slew of pieces of information. And I think we're all kind of on this journey together. And how can doctors, thrive in these environments? I actually think that
Yeah.
it's adapting and figuring out new ways to both complement and honestly, it's sort of, I think, somewhat reassuring that doctors and physicians and individual scientists and individual doctors continue to score really high on these trust metrics, that people still really do trust their doctors. But systemically, I mean, a third of people don't even have primary care physicians in this country, right? So it's great that you trust your doctor, but if you don't have a doctor, that's a problem. Or people are skipping going to the doctor because of high copays, right? So
Yeah.
systemically, we are also not setting ourselves up for success if we aren't actually allowing folks to have that interface with doctors.
Yeah, I agree. I agree. And so going back to the episodes and the work you do in the podcast, as I said, like some of the episodes you bring in doctors, but you also bring in public health communicators and people who mistrust them. Are there good examples you would tell people? I think almost all of your episodes are excellent, but are there specific ones where you think this is exemplar conversation of how to have that conversation? You said like it's both and like the public health official or the public health expert or the physician, they listen to the people who have mistrust, but also at the same time, it's a back and forth conversation that leaves at least the door open for more conversations. Are there a few that you had that you thought, oh, this was really good? Everyone should really model that engagement.
Yeah. I would say our first two Maha public health conversations, it's worth listening to. We did one back in May of last year, and I think we followed up pretty soon after that, a few weeks later. I would also say we did another one at the beginning of this year, January 2026, where we brought together doctors along with some Maha followers. And that one was really an interesting conversation too, because we were just asking patients kind of what their experience is at the doctors, but then we were also asking doctors what the experience is of being a doctor. And it was really interesting to see the interplay, two people who ordinarily the power dynamic is like doctor is up here, patient is down there. It's a very like patient is there to listen to the doctor. But what's interesting on our show is we kind of bring everyone to the same level, and doctors express their frustrations with the system and what it's like only having a few minutes with a patient and then, having to do so much administrative work, what it's like interfacing with a patient who's vaccine hesitant, where they land in conversations like that, and then having a patient talk to the doctor, a mom talk to a doctor about what it was like for her when she was vaccine skeptical, but felt like she was being coerced into taking one at the moment. I just think those conversations are so phenomenal because you're really just seeing people, I'm so humbled by how much vulnerability people bring to these conversations and how much they're willing to share. And we really take time in the beginning part of the conversation to set a tone, that we always say, we're not looking for a cage fight. This is like, I always say, you're invited to my house for dinner. We're all, sitting around the table having a conversation. Sometimes dinner parties, you can have debates, they can get rowdy, but at the end of the night, everyone maybe leaves and two people might go off and get another drink together, right?
Yeah.
We're not also trying to create kumbaya situations. This is a tough time. There's a lot of changes happening to public health. A lot of them are being perceived as really destructive. I can understand that pain. A lot of folks in the Maha movement are very frustrated. They think their priorities are just being thrown out the window by this administration. And also, they also sometimes don't feel heard by public health folks, that they feel judged for some of the choices they're making. So these are not easy times. And we're not claiming that, our little podcast is like there to have everyone hold hands. It's really more that if we're not engaging with each other, things actually aren't going to get better. If we keep ping-ponging back and forth between administrations, all that does is it maybe buys time for people, but it doesn't actually solve fundamental problems of democracy and consensus building and being able to actually work through friction. That friction is actually, in our view, it actually makes us stronger. And our algorithms and our ecosystems have actually created environments where we don't need to interface with each other. All all we have is each other's tribes. And if my tribe really likes everything I'm saying, I think it's right, you know?
Yeah.
And if you don't actually have to interface with somebody and like test out your views and have that friction in like a safe space, I actually worry that it doesn't make us stronger citizens. It doesn't actually
Yeah.
test our ideas out. You know, are we presenting the best versions of our ideas out there?
Well, you said actually just described how I felt being on social media. I left my last social media account maybe 4 or 5 years ago, which was interesting because it was bad because it felt like you were just being exposed to a lot of things. I think the last one I left maybe was Twitter at the time. But at the same time, I realized I think it made me a worse version of myself because it's just, I always wanted to write the thing that was going to get likes and retweets from the people who like me, which meant I just felt I was just becoming like a worse version of myself for no reason other than just being on a platform where I felt like, oh, this is going to get me more attention from my tribe or my team. So I think it just, yeah, it describes not all of our conversation, but also just like, honestly, I feel like how also social media now design us to
I mean, it's
interact with
set
the
up
world.
that way.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
it's it's literally designed to give you a dopamine hit every time
Yep.
you get a like or a comment or a retweet or whatever, a repost.
Yeah.
And I think, look, there's many positives to being able to
Yeah.
share information. There's many positives to being able to use platforms to get something out there. But I will say we're now living in an era where just passive posting, where someone just posts something and expects people are going to like look at it and comment or whatever. We are, I think, moving into an era now where people are seeking more engagement in terms of
Yes.
things like chat groups, like one-to-one messenger apps, where there's more of a bi-directional relationship
Yeah.
as opposed to like a unidirectional relationship
Yeah.
where even people in a more digitally savvy space, you know,
Yeah.
you don't want to be seen as only delivering information. You want to be seen as engaging with your community. And notice I didn't say audience, I said community.
Yeah.
Think about building community with your followers as opposed to building audience with them. Audiences are passive, communities are active, and people
Mm.
want more active engagement these days.
Then going back to your conversations, and I really like what you said about setting the stage of we want to have a conversation. It's a dinner party. Things can get testy, but at the end of the night, hopefully everyone has like take back some glass of wine or leftovers and we're all good to go and we'll come back for the next dinner party. But I have to say, some of them get really testy, at least the episodes I listen to. And
Sure
I
do.
want to use the Dr. Jay Paracharya's, the head of NIH's episode, because I want you to walk through maybe, and that could be one example, but others as well. I recommend people listen to that episode where I don't know if you realize from the beginning the conversation is going to get testy very quickly, or do you think it just throughout the episode something might happen that make the conversation seem like it just seemed like it led to a lot more friction, at least from my perspective, than the questions warranted. And I wasn't sure if that was because of the prep, or do you think sometimes just something happens during an episode where people feel the need to then become more combative?
Yeah, I mean, some of this, look, it's more questions for Jay, I think, more than
Yeah.
anything. But I would say, look, that episode, we're really proud of that episode. We're really grateful that he came to sit for that interview. And I'd say what we're really proud of is we've built this platform where people who are inside the administration, outside the administration, inside public health, outside public health, we're trying to create a space where they all feel welcome. It's really
Yeah.
important to us that everybody feels welcome on our show, even if they're tough interviews, even if there's friction. You know, we left actually just thanking him, had a good back and forth with his team afterwards. Like being civil is really important to us. Look, I think we're in a really interesting moment right now for a lot of folks in science who are seeing, you know, things that ordinarily would get funded are not getting funded, grants that would ordinarily get at least looked at are not getting looked at. There's a sense that there's this very top down, you know, sort of approach to deciding what is good science and what's not. And part of what we wanted to do, as any good journalist does, is really just try to understand how somebody thinks and why they
Right.
make decisions the way they do. And for us, when you're interviewing somebody who's in charge of like the world's or what was once the world's leading biomedical research institution, you want to understand that if there's a lot of disruption taking place, what is behind that? So we prepared for that, just wanting to first understand what is the current kind of status of how NIH is being run and what it does. And then how does he sort of explain the changes, right? And so we, you know, I don't know that any of us were particularly contentious in that interview. I think we were asking very honest questions. We were showing data, and we just wanted to understand what was behind certain choices of how money was allocated at the NIH. And I think, I just perceived that some of those questions were really difficult questions to maybe answer for him.
Yeah.
And he approached that in a certain way, and he decided to bring a certain personality to it and a certain attitude to it. And I think that it can be, I have a lot of empathy for people who are in positions of power. They have to take a lot of incoming all day. I don't know actually that he's, in my estimation, aside from like congressional hearings, I don't know that he's done a ton of interviews that have been quite that challenging. And so, maybe it was partly that, but we didn't go into it expecting that we wanted it to be like some sort of a fight. And I don't even know that I felt coming out of it that we were fighting necessarily. I just think it was a difficult, challenging interview, and it's a difficult, challenging times,
Yeah.
I mean, like, it is what it is.
That was one episode I felt like, I don't know if that was your sense from it. It was hard to give answers in public that wouldn't make someone angry as a political appointee. That was the moment it felt like, this is more about politics than just having the conversation about the disagreement, because anything you will say here, it would have like a political weight and it would just make someone unhappy. And again, I don't want to, like, it would be a question for Dr. Paricharya, but it seems like picking which side are you willing to make more angry than the other. And that just seems like part of the attitude. But I agree. I think it was a very interesting episode also of just continuing a conversation, even if it was clear, like it was just hard and challenging conversation. Were there any other episodes you felt like this is just going off the rails, or someone was making, I think that episode you came with data. I don't necessarily think at the end it was too contentious, at least on your end, or I think it was helpful for the listener, but were there others where you felt like just people coming with bad faith arguments? And I don't know if it's helpful to continue to have this conversation.
Good faith, bad faith is tricky in these situations, because the truth is, many members of our audience think that people are operating in bad faith, each side, right?
Yeah.
I think there are times where people have come in with talking points and they're not really listening. I don't really know that I want to like identify particular episodes in that way,
that's fair.
because I think that it's more that when people come in because they view it as an opportunity to sort of like own the other side, you know what I mean? I get the instinct. That's sort of how we're primed these days. Like if you're ever in a situation where you get a chance to talk to somebody from the quote unquote other side, you want to win, right? Where I think the conversations are more successful is when people recognize that there's disagreements and they try to like challenge themselves to think through those disagreements and ask questions about why the person disagrees. And then occasionally maybe even leans into, look, I know you're saying what you're saying, but I've looked at like these studies, and these studies just don't show that. And I'm trying to understand like how we move forward from that. And maybe we don't move forward, but I just want you to know that that's where we're landing. And sometimes, I recently read an article where somebody said, sometimes conflict is just that, where you end in conflict and you still then decide, okay, we don't agree on that. Let's move on, and that may be the best you do. Then there are times where they may disagree on certain things, but the discovery is really where they're agreeing.
Yeah.
And, look, I'll say for me, as I'm not a public health practitioner. I am not some card carrying member of MAHA either, I'm just a journalist who is trying to understand this moment. And I would say more than that, I'll put myself in this more, is that I'm sort of identifying these two groups who care a lot about health. They really do. And unlike other groups where maybe their values are really misaligned on things, in this case, they are actually aligned on a lot of things, but they are really misaligned on other things. And our show has sort of identified that, like, why wouldn't they work together on certain things? It seems like they could potentially be stronger together on certain things than apart, particularly since they each bring different skill sets to this moment. With public health, they're bringing an enormous amount of evidence-backed information. They're bringing years of expertise and data. With some of the folks who are more like mistrusting of institutions or MAHA, they have incredible organizing abilities, incredible storytelling abilities, and incredible ability to mobilize people around particular causes. And I think that those are things that both of those groups sort of have deficits in that the other group can provide. And I understand, look, it's not like I'm not naive in thinking that somehow people are going to walk into the sunset holding hands. I totally get that. But in this time where we're so fractured and so atomized and so kind of in our little bubbles, any chance you get for kind of two bubbles to meet to make a bigger bubble, you're actually giving an opportunity to potentially put more firepower behind solving a problem.
And honestly, I think the Maha movement, for example, or other movements, they also sometimes force us to identify blind spots that we haven't paid as much attention to in public health and medicine. So that is, I think, part of the hopeful, at least for us in public health learning, is to say maybe we haven't spent that much time thinking about what type of science and research and advocacy and policy making we need to advance on food policies that we haven't done as much in that we should have. And maybe that wouldn't have provided space for other actors to come in. So then, are there conversations or disagreements? I know you mentioned there are value alignment between the groups that you actually talk to, just they see things differently. Are there specific disagreements you think this is actually not something that should be platforms? It's not going to be helpful to have a conversation on. I really struggle with this because at least my starting point now is if I say any conversation is not worth having in public health, that just like closes the door on something that is happening in someone's life. So I'm not sure if there is a editorial policy you have on that.
Yeah. As a journalist, this is something that in many ways, the issue of platforming is like a tricky one, right? Because journalists historically have talked to anybody. I mean, they've sat down with like the heads of the KKK and like they've sat down with, people who've been like known to be serial killers and things like that, because the whole idea is you're bringing an experience and a way of thinking and a way of behaving in society that can hopefully create clarity for how people work, how people think, how people are. So I still put myself in that category that I have very few red lines. I don't really believe in this idea that you can't, of like platforming someone airs their ideas out. It's sort of to me, a fundamental misread of how people absorb information. A lot of these folks have massive platforms already, and their information is out there. Them coming on my show is not necessarily airing them more. In some ways, we joke that when they come on our show, they're taking a break from being platformed because we have a less audience than they do. So in some ways, you may thank us for that 1 hour. They're not platforming themselves on their bigger platforms. I think the main thing for us is how do we show up on these shows? I know some people think we don't push back enough. I respect that. Maybe there are instances where if I go back and listen, I wish I had said something. Of course, I'm a human being and there are times where I would have shown up differently. But I think our show is not a show where we're just trying to bring people on to debate them and to fact check them. That is really not what this is about. Our show is to try and create an atmosphere where when people come on, they can be heard, they can be understood, and we can make clear that like what they're saying is not always agreed with by people. And there are some people out there who think what they're saying is wrong. And what do they think about that? So we'll say that. But to assume, I think sometimes people want to see that like fact check because there's something really satisfying about like hearing that like, no, vaccines don't cause autism. Instead, what we say is, look, there's dozens of studies out there that are cited that don't find a link, right? But yet they're not convincing you. So why is that? That to us is a more interesting question than trying to spend an hour trying to convince someone that they're wrong about vaccines and autism.
So you're 18 months in now, I think. I was wondering if what you said right now, did that approach change over time or did it evolve over time, reaching that point of like, we're here to listen? Or from the beginning, that was the approach that you stuck with and you think was very helpful?
Well, it's funny. When we first started the show, we were really debating who our very first guest was going to be. It could be like a big name person in public health. It could be a scientist, a researcher, or like a politician, somebody, right? Just to come out with a bang. Instead, we decided we were going to interview a Maha mom. And the reason we wanted to do that was we wanted to set the tone that this show was really going to elevate the voices of regular people and why they arrive at decisions the way they do. I don't know that we ever thought we were going to host conversations with like leaders in public health and leaders in Maha. That was not the goal from the beginning. I think the beginning goal was just to listen to people who, have thoughts where they don't trust systems and we want to understand. But then like 5 or 6 months in, we saw this opportunity and we were realizing that this was not really being done anywhere. And once we did it, it sort of blew up. And believe me, we faced a lot of criticism when it came out. We continue to face criticism, but really we face a lot more people supporting the idea and the journey than we face criticism. And we just realized that there appears to be some sort of appetite for like a way of talking that feels, even though it's like it may expose serious fault lines and disagreements, that there's a desire to see people who maybe are misaligned in certain ways, like speak civilly to each other. It sort of provides a model for how other people can pursue that in their lives. And, the truth is, there are a lot of people who say to us, like, we just don't hear these perspectives because these aren't people we follow.
Hmm.
Both sides say that. And in a way, we're really grateful that we can be that platform that can surface those things that people don't ordinarily hear in their lives. And I know it's difficult for certain people. And I know at times it makes, people tell us it makes them want to throw the phone across the room and like, why are we platforming and all that stuff. But I'll tell you, if I wanted to make a show that made everybody comfortable, I would have made a cooking show. I'm not here to make people comfortable. I'm here to help people understand who our country is and how we can respond to the country's needs based on who our country is. To not demonize people, to realize that everybody comes from some place. Maybe they take some bad turns and maybe those bad turns can be dangerous. I fully recognize that, but that we are ultimately human beings and we're kind of in this bowl that's like swimming pool together. And how are we going to be in it? How are we going to do this?
Yeah. Aside from the fact that I don't watch cooking shows, but I'm pretty sure I can go online and find one that is extremely combative and send it to you because nothing.
Listen, there are cooking shows where there's like that hot ones where people eat super spicy food, and that can be pretty uncomfortable to watch. So you're right.
Yeah.
There can be some spicy cooking shows.
Yeah. So one last question here is for public health people, because we're starting this, and honestly, it's been amazing just getting public health people emails who are saying, oh, I really do want to engage more with a public health that is not viewed as ideological. If they want to have more conversations that include disagreement, what would be your advice to them? How should they start the conversation, and what should be the goal of those conversations?
Look, a big part of it that we hear from folks in public health is like they want help in just finding people to even have the conversations with. And I will say everyone has somebody in their life, if they really thought about it, whether it's a family member or it's somebody they work with or somebody they've interfaced with or a patient or something. And I would just start to become really mindful in those moments, to think through and like observe yourself and really engage in like a practice of trying to understand what that other person is saying and just ask them questions. You're not there to correct them in the moment unless you really love them and they know you really well and you talk to them all the time like you do with your mother. Of course, like go to town. My mom and I talk about all kinds of things and she says something. But if it's a moment where it's somebody you don't interface with all that often, approach it with curiosity. Approach it with a sense that like you want to learn something. And then I would encourage your schools, your office places, your public health departments to invite people into your spaces who may not otherwise have thought they were welcome. I just attended an American Public Health Association conference where they invited somebody from the podcast who's Maha, and she gave a keynote at the APHA policy forum, and people in the audience asked questions, and sometimes there was some friction, and they engaged in this really, I think, a really productive conversation, and it was extraordinary. I don't think APHA, like, I really applaud them for being open to that, and I applaud the Maha person, the Maha mom, Jacqueline Capriati, for coming on and being willing to be in that environment that isn't necessarily friendly to her way of thinking, right? And for often good reasons. The other side is feeling very attacked at the moment. So these are all valid reasons, but it's not valid enough to not engage, in my view.
Yeah.
So I would say really invest in those opportunities. And the other thing is, just engage with your community. You all are all located in areas, whether it's in St. Louis or whether it's New Haven or all of these places that are all physically nested in these communities where people have all kinds of views on things,
Yeah.
Engage with them. What are they feeling about how, I don't know, the lead pipes are working in their environment? Are they getting the services they need? What bothers them? Where do they feel uncomfortable? Engage. You don't always have to be super high-minded and very like trying to solve the biggest problems in the world. Sometimes looking in your own backyard can actually be a really interesting way of seeing problem solving in general. I think right now it can feel like unless we're taking the biggest swings ever, that all we're doing is nibbling around the edges. And I will say, some of the most successful change movements, I mean, they've taken years. Anybody who thinks that their lives have gotten really uncomfortable over the last year and a half of this administration, and unless we're doing something that immediately changes it back, like, that's just not how change works. We all got to put in our work right now. We all got to kind of be in the trenches and do our own part. And so I think trying to find opportunities to convene, to engage, to meet with people that you don't ordinarily agree with, to coalition build. That's where my head is at right now.
Brinda, thank you so much for joining me today. I know it's very hot where you are right now, so I really appreciate it.
I'm grateful for my air conditioner, but thank you so much. It's been a real honor chatting with you, Salma.
This episode was edited by Catalina Melendez-Contreras with marketing and outreach by Kinkini Bahaduri. The podcast is supported by the School of Public Health and the Frick Initiative at Washington University in St. Louis. You can find Complicating the Narrative wherever you get your podcast, and you can also watch the episodes on YouTube. If you found this conversation useful, rating, sharing, or recommending the podcast is one of the best ways to help us reach more people. Thank you for listening.